Okay, the moment is here. Thank you all for coming. These are just about maybe a quarter of the wonderful young singers we have been having the pleasure of working with for the past, I guess it's 6 weeks now. It feels like an epoch in everybody's lives, an annual epoch in Teatro Nuovo's life, because the heart of what we are trying to do here is give a young generation a fresh idea of the ways and means of Italian singing, which doesn't mean just the trills and ornaments, of which you heard some and you will hear some more in the show tonight, but also the phrasing, the lingering, the hurrying, the unabashed emotion, the legato lines that make up the great Italian tradition of singing. And so, we now pass to the greatest exponent of all of that tradition, Giuseppe Verdi. And I would just like to know, before I start talking about Macbeth, how many of you have seen the usual version of Verdi's Macbeth? Okay, so more than half. And how many have seen Shakespeare's Macbeth? Okay, Shakespeare is ahead. And how many love the music of Verdi? Okay, I think we got to 100%. Good. Great. The original version of Macbeth is something that has been on our wish list at Teatro Nuovo practically since we began, and so we are really thrilled to be able to do it tonight. It occupies an unusual place in Verdi's output. You know, he wrote, depending on how you count certain revisions, basically he wrote 27 principal operas. And in almost all of them, he tinkered after the premiere. So even a hit like La Traviata, which was not a hit on the first night, got revised a little bit and tried again the following year. And even Aida wasn't completely finished when it had its premiere in Cairo. There was some new stuff for the premiere in Milano later the same year, such as the soprano's big aria, O Patria Mia. And so he was always a reviser, but in the case of 4 operas, he left 2 completely different versions of the same title, Simon Boccanegra, Don Carlo, La Forza del Destino, and Macbeth. And the biggest distance between the first version and the second is Macbeth, which means we have to try to locate the 1847 Macbeth in Verdi's life where it actually sits, because what we know is an amalgam of 2 very different Verdis. Let me just sort of give you the outline, which most of you already know, but just to be precise about where this fits. His first opera came out in 1839, and he had a little bit of a rocky start, but very early in his career, with his 3rd, 4th, and 5th operas, which were Nabucco, I Lombardi, Ernani, all 3 still played all the time and beloved today, he quickly established himself as the leading new Italian composer, the heir of Donizetti, you could say. And they made him in demand wherever he could be contracted. Within a decade, he had written over a dozen operas, and about a decade after that trio, he wrote another trio, Rigoletto, Il Trovatore, La Traviata, even more beloved today, and these made him the most performed opera composer in the entire world, internationally and at home. And they were the end of what he later called his years in the galley, working like a slave. He composed 18 operas in the period 1839 to 1853, and that's 2/3 of his total operas. 1/3 remained. Those were composed in a 14-year span. The remaining ones were composed in a 38-year span. Therefore, as you can see by doing the math, he slowed his pace quite dramatically. And by slowing his pace, he gave himself room to undergo a kind of evolution, one of the most profound evolutions in the whole history of music, and certainly the most significant to this day of any Italian composer. By evolution, we don't necessarily just mean improvement. He became a different kind of composer. And the great thing, when you remember that early trio of operas, Nabucco, I Lombardi, Hernani, is that Verdi was a great composer, a composer of genius and inspiration and dramatic truth and strong instinct in all phases of his long career. And so, where does Macbeth fit into this? Well, it came hard on the heels of that original trio. Those are blood and guts operas. They pack a punch. They are concise. They are a little bombastic, some critics felt at the time, but they absolutely appealed to the rising Italian spirit of the Risorgimento, of the country that was not yet a country. It was a nation in the sense of a people that united by history and language and culture, but not yet a unified nation state. And Verdi was really the prophet of the Risorgimento. In fact, they were clever enough to figure out that his name spelled Vittorio Emanuele Re d'Italia. And there were cities where you could be arrested for shouting Viva Verdi because of that. So this Verdi confronted for the first time the dramatist who meant the most to him all through his long life, and that is Shakespeare. And so before we talk about the differences between the versions, I would like to just talk a little bit about what was the 1847 Macbeth like in 1847 terms. I want to draw you a picture of what Italian opera was at that time. It was the big show in every town. It's what people all had in common that they could discuss with each other. It was it was even more penetrating of the general culture than a hit movie is today, because it stood that far above all the other possible art forms, and there weren't so many at the time. You know, there wasn't TV, there wasn't cinema, there wasn't even professional sports to give scandals, there wasn't, there was professional pop music didn't exist. Pop music meant music of the people, practiced by the people, among the people. And so opera was really the pinnacle. And the whole town would crowd the theater to render their judgment on each new opera. And Verdi's Macbeth, in that sense, was a smash success in Florence in 1847. He was called on stage to take a bow 38 times during the performance. The murder duet of Lady Macbeth and Macbeth was performed that evening 3 times, but by the end of the run, sometimes it was encored so much that on one night it was performed 5 times. The idea of hearing an opera in church-like silence did not exist for Italy. Not then, and not for a long, long, long time after. They were participants. They called out their opinions during the show. If you hear a piece tonight that ends with bum 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 bum, that's not supposed to be listened to in religious silence. That is to accompany your applause if you feel like giving it. So don't be inhibited when you hear that. You will hear it several times tonight. So that was the atmosphere into which Verdi inserted the most unusual things that he did in Macbeth, because it was a daring opera for the time. Start with this. You just heard the usual content of Italian poetry, right? Macbeth has no guess what story. No love story. No love story. In fact, the tenor is kind of a bystander of the action. He has a most gorgeous aria, and you are in for a treat when you hear it sung tonight. But he is basically there to be a victim of the Macbeths. And the bass, Banco, is there also to be a victim. And the opera focuses almost entirely on the relationships, plural, of the Macbeths to each other, to the supernatural world of the witches, to their victims, and their crimes and the victims of those crimes, and to their own eventual psychological disintegration. So that is not the usual pivot of an Italian opera at that time, and especially the supernatural element of the witches. Verdi later insisted that there are three main characters in Macbeth: Macbeth, Lady Macbeth, and the chorus of the witches, which has unusual prominence, and the very first number in the opera, which is a chorus of witches, was also the very first thing to be encored at the premiere performance. Macbeth, therefore, immediately traveled throughout the Italian peninsula. Within its first decade of life, it had been heard on 100 stages. Now, here is something that I didn't know before I started, brushing up my Shakespeare for this season. At that time, there had been no performance in any part of Italy of Shakespeare's Macbeth. It had a life, it had a literary life. There had been translations of it, including the one that we know about, which one Verdi knew it from. Unfortunately, it was about the worst one published yet, but it's important to us because it was important to Verdi. So at first, Macbeth was an opera by Verdi with a foreign play somewhere in the background. And one of the things that says the most to me about the impact of Verdi is this. The opera goes up in 1847 in Florence. It's circulating everywhere. In 1849, it reaches Milano, La Scala. And in 1849, in Milano, after the opera is a huge success there comes the first Italian performance of Shakespeare's Macbeth. That was Alemanno Morelli, I forgot it. But Alemanno Morelli, who became the first Italian actor to play Shakespeare's Macbeth, and he used a text by a friend of Verdi, Giulio Carcano, that was a new translation of Shakespeare written around the same time. It has so much in common with Piave's libretto that we don't know for sure whether Carcano was influenced by Piave or Piave was influenced by a draft of Carcano's translation. We are still, that is still an open question for the scholarly world. But what is astonishing is within a generation, okay, if you know Italian theater, these names will speak to you. Ernesto Rossi, Adelaide Ristori, Eleonora Duse. I'm not seeing too many nods. Tommaso Salvini. Okay, these were superstars of the Italian theater. Duse later became the lover of Arrigo Boito, who was the librettist of Verdi's last two Shakespeare operas. And they were all famous as either Macbeth or Lady Macbeth. You could say, in fact, that one of Verdi's accomplishments was that he gave Shakespeare an Italian stage career. Shakespeare gave Verdi a lot in return. The elements that you're going to hear tonight in Macbeth are some of the most important for Verdi's evolution. He had, in particular, a way of filling up what Italian opera calls recitative, the talking parts of the opera, where the action happens and filling in between, where time stops for an aria or a duet or what have you. And Verdi had this way of packing recitative with more and more musical material until it became something beyond what recitative meant for, let's say, Mozart or Rossini. An example, remember in Rigoletto where Rigoletto compares himself to the assassin and then rages against his life as a court jester and so forth? That is a recitative. It's the recitative that introduces his duet with Gilda. Or Iago's creed, where he says that he believes in a cruel God that created him in that God's own image. That's a recitative. Falstaff's honor monologue is a recitative. And that line of monologues, dramatic soliloquies for baritone, that line begins with Macbeth's speech when he says, "Is this a dagger I see before me?" which comes straight from Shakespeare, quite condensed. But you will hear tonight that Shakespeare prompted him to this particular kind of dramatic monologue that sort of packed together what had been recitative and what would become dramatic arias. And it was, in a way, Verdi's lifelong project, to blend the musical numbers and the recitative together into something seamless, which is exactly what we find in Aida, Otello, and above all, Falstaff. And so he was launching on that road in 1847. There is also a very fantastic piece, maybe the most successful overall piece in the opera, even considered so today, which I will talk about in just a moment. But amongst these wonderful things, there was also a great patriotic chorus. Verdi was known as the Pope of choruses, and he wrote one of his best for the early Macbeth, and then decided, when he came to revise it years later, that it had become too old-fashioned, and he replaced it with something that could have come straight out of the grimmest scenes in Don Carlo. And that is a little bit of the problem with Macbeth. So let me tell you now what happened that made us have the version that we know today. In the 1860s, the Théâtre Lyrique in Paris had been having great success mounting French versions of Verdi's most popular operas. Those operas were not new for Paris, but Paris had several theaters with their own distinct audiences. So Rigoletto and Il Trovatore and La Traviata had been heard as Italian operas at the Théâtre des Italiens, but they were heard in French, and in some cases with little tweaks by Verdi, at a theater with a French tradition and a French audience. And the managers thought that Macbeth would make a great successor to those three. And they just asked Verdi if he would please write some ballet music for it, because that's what you wanted to add to, for a French opera. And he agreed to do that. And then he looked at the score and decided he wanted to do more. He wrote to the impresario, upon looking into the score, I was surprised to see things I would rather not have found. Now, we can speculate what he might have meant by this, but when you look at what he did with the score, what he found was caballettas. How many are familiar with the term cabaletta? Okay, so again, we're scoring about half, and I will explain. The cabaletta was, arias had, for a long time, there was a certain form of aria that has slow part and fast part. You find them in Mozart's operas, you find them in Rossini. In Rossini's time, he codified the fast part of the aria into a particular style and form that became known as the cabaletta. We still don't know for sure the derivation of that term. Probably it has something to do with horses. Maybe it's a battle horse, I don't know. But it is, maybe it's related to cavalcata, which is what they call the ride of the Valkyries in Italian. Anyway, these punchy arias became the hit ingredient of any new Italian opera for at least 2 generations. And they had a handful of things in common. One is the tune has to be easy to remember. The first one that became a mega hit was by Rossini. Di Tanti Palpiti, which was sung all over the peninsula, and you can see why it's easy to remember. And you know, this idea that it begins with that's one of Verdi's most famous caballettas. And they all work that way. Simple tune, regular rhythm, easy to remember, accompaniment in simple chords without counterpoint, without complexity, generally speaking. They end with a coda. In Rossini, it's repeated with full orchestra playing, and the singer singing as loud as he can, and the often repeated sequence. There was also always a repeat, an exact repeat of the music, part or all of it, which the singer might ornament and vary to show virtuosity and imagination the second time around. And so this form, refined critics thought of it as being not to say cheap, but certainly populist, and rather regretted its popularity, and eventually Verdi wanted to turn away from it. Just after writing Di quella pira, one of his most famous, and his other most famous is from La Traviata. And he, in that long evolution, where he wrote far fewer operas and much slower, he gradually phased out the cabaletta. He was ready for something else, for some scenes to end quietly, or for some scenes that wanted a fast jolt of energy at the end, to have just a page and a half of excited music, much shorter than the formal cabaletta had been. And so when he opened up Macbeth, well, remember, the first Macbeth comes just shortly after Ernani, and just before I Masnadieri and La Battaglia di Legnano and those patriotic potboilers, Giovanna d'Arco. And the second Macbeth comes in between La Forza del Destino and Don Carlo. So that is heavily into the mature Verdi. And so he opens the old score and sees that there are 5 solo caballettas, 3 of them out. And the 5 caballettas in the first Macbeth have a common theme, just like the album for Piave, but it's not the same theme. All 5 are about one thing: violent death. 3 are literally about murder. And the first, which did make it into the final version, is Lady Macbeth. Remember the spirit, the speech, "Come ye spirits that tend on mortal thoughts, unsex me here." That was turned into "Or tutti sorgete ministri infernali." Now all arise, infernal spirits. So he sets up a pounding rhythm for Lady Macbeth to call on the spirits. What's she calling on them to do? To steel her nerve to murder King Duncan so that her husband can ascend to the throne. Her next cabaletta was struck out, and it's when she and Macbeth have decided that the next murder should be Banco, because the witches predicted that his children would reign as kings, and they want their children, if they have any, to reign as kings, and so Banco needs to be sent to the kingdom of the next world. And the Verdi of 1865 was not so keen on having her celebrate that with such bloodthirsty joy, but what she sings is... It's a violent celebration of violence. And then the next one, also cut out, was for Macbeth himself, when he decides to burn down the castle of Macduff and kill his wife and children. He would like to kill Macduff as well, but Macduff has fled to the borders of England so that he can sing his beautiful aria, which you will hear, and come back to defeat Macbeth in battle. But meanwhile, I'm not sure I know all of them by memory. Let me try. Okay, this is Macbeth's cabaletta in Act 3, saying, "Let the castle of Macduff go up in flames, and let all the blood fatal to me be exterminated." It's in the spirit of Di quella pira, but in minor and fatal sounding. That too, out. The very end of the opera, which is Macbeth's death. Now, that is the one piece from the original Macbeth that sometimes gets stuck into the familiar Macbeth. because it ends with a very innovative and almost unrecognizable cabaletta, in which the catchy accompaniment is reduced. It's still simple chords, but it's reduced to a sort of funeral march of simple chords. And the element of repetition is omitted entirely, and the tune is broken phrases for a dying man. Verdi actually had a model for this. In Vaccai's Giulietta e Romeo, his setting of the Romeo and Juliet story, he gives the dying Romeo exactly such a cabaletta. Broken phrases, the funereal chords, and no repetition. And in this case, he sings, Al per me, che m'affidai, ne presagi dell'inferno. Now, it is still a cabaletta. He could have written, so it's still the same form, and it's still the same structure, but bent to the dramatic purpose of finishing the opera with a quite grim death scene, as Macbeth finally expresses regret for what he has been doing all through the 4 acts of the opera, which is bloody murder. So that is the Macbeth that we hear tonight. It is carved from one block of marble, like Ernani, like Nabucco. If we heard Ernani in a production that inserted, okay, it's a drama of feudal and royal Spain in centuries before Verdi's time, so is Don Carlos. We could insert 3 scenes from Don Carlos into Ernani, maybe the king and the inquisitor, or the auto da fe, or something like that. Well, when you turn the page back to Ernani after that, it's likely to sound old-fashioned and even primitive. And that is the way we usually experience Macbeth. It's not that the new music isn't great, it is fantastic music. I mean, no Verdian would want to live without the new music that he wrote. But it does sort of put us in a different mood, and that makes it difficult to have the mood of the other music. Whereas when we hear Nabucco or Ernani, we stay in one style for the whole opera, and it all rings true. That's how we feel about this first Macbeth. The second Macbeth, it came into being in Paris, as I told you, in a contest with Meyerbeer's L'Africaine, and Macbeth lost the contest. It ran for 14 performances. L'Africaine hit 100 performances before the year was out. And the new Macbeth took a long time to catch on. It actually caught on in Germany, of all places, because there was, in Germany, between the world wars, there was a revival of interest in the forgotten operas of Verdi, which did not really have international circulation. Things like I Due Foscari, Alzira even, La Battaglia di Legnano, Macbeth, Luisa Miller, all of those came back to life through German performances, and the one reason we know them so well in New York, there was a conductor in Dresden, Fritz Busch, who specialized in early Verdi, and he revived Macbeth in Dresden in 1929, and then he fled the Third Reich, and he went to Glyndebourne, where he revived Macbeth in 1938. And running Glyndebourne at that time was his fellow refugee from the Third Reich, Rudolf Bing, who came to the Met in 1950 and revived Verdi, including Macbeth, at the Met, and made Verdi revivals a hallmark of his long tenure at the Met. So now Macbeth is a part of the standard repertoire, and the Italians, learning from the Germans in this case, revived Macbeth at La Scala after these German revivals, 1952 with Maria Callas, 1975 with Claudio Abbado conducting and Giorgio Strehler directing, and so now we all know and love Macbeth, but we almost never hear the Macbeth that was such a hit at the time. And I guess the way to leave you with this is, Verdi opened the score and found things that his new self didn't want. But we, who love Nabucco and Hernani and the very different Verdi who composed them, are absolutely free to want all of Verdi, very much including the Macbeth that he presented in Florence in 1847. I hope you all love it as much as we have loved working on it. Thank you for being here.